Alrighty, we are now looking at the PR1 Mil reticle in Leupold's Mark IV HD 4.5 to 18 by 52 scope. PR1 Mil is kind of an interesting design in the sense that was one of my many surprises from this year. I apologize about the dog barking. My neighbor's dog never shuts up, unfortunately. But anyhow, nice dog otherwise. But um, it is a kind of a little bit of an evolution on the TMR design, but where they try to take it into a more modern world. You still have these varying thicknesses of main stadia. There is no tree. There is a floating dot, thin lines outside for the 5 mil radian near the center, up 0.04 mil. Then it thickens to 0.15 for the main stadia, and then to 0.25 toward the edges. You end up with a reticle that is quite easy to pick up. It looks nice and dark. It looks a little bit thicker than it actually is. And for shooting plates or for hunting, I found this reticle to work very, very nicely. This was the scope I used to shoot an antelope last year, and the reticle worked exceedingly well. Then again, antelope hunted mostly in broad daylight. I did spend some time doing things with the scope in low light, and I found that overall the reticle was pretty easy to use. We are now getting relatively close to sunset. Sun is not quite set yet, but there is no direct light above me. I am going to start clicking the reticle on. There's a push button illumination, and you will start seeing this thing come on. As you go through, you cycle through several different illumination levels. Okay, now we're very dark. And that's relatively bright. Okay. We're gonna go back down from 18 up on 14. Now you start seeing a little bit thicker stuff going out. And what is illuminated is a central cross. That's roughly 20 by 20 milliradians. So relatively large, but it's not too bad. And on lower powers, it does not seem to do anything bad to my night adaptation. Now we're on 10 power. Since it's an 18 power scope, Leupold rather cleverly put in a little hash mark right here at about 9 power. Ended up for a lot of the plate shooting, etc., being somewhere between 9 and 12. Worked well for me. Let me see if I can. We're now on 8, 6, and 4.5. Even on lowest power, let me see if I can. It is not super hard to see this reticle. Still works nicely. Right, and if you look at it against any sort of a background, you can still see it's not the thickest reticle in the world on low power, but it is surprisingly visible across most backgrounds I tried it against. Let's look at this roof. There's a lot of dynamic range here, so the camera is struggling a little bit with exposure. Now that we've refocused, I'm going to adjust the image focus a little bit, something more appropriate to the distance, and I'm going to go back up in power. 6, when I was walking around with the scope, I had it sitting on 6 magnification. 8, 10, 12, 14, and 18. Okay. When you see this whole thing blinking, that's probably a pretty good indication that I've tilted something out of the way. It does have an electronic level. There we go. Now we're going to stop with the blinking. Electronic level turned out to be not hugely beneficial for me, simply because I was never really that far off. I never thought I was under the pressure that electronic level will make a big difference, but I was just naturally setting up the rifle within the sensitivity range of electronic level, which I think is a couple degrees. That was a little bit unexpected, but I suspected that as a fail-safe electronic level where the reticle starts blinking at you, is probably beneficial. In broad daylight, even on a relatively bright reticle illumination, looking at something not very dark, I don't know if I'm going to see this blinking or not, but against a dark plate, you would see it. The way this reticle is constructed, for the inner plus minus 5 milliradian, you have 0.2 milliradian hash marks, and outside of that, it switches out to 0.5, which is a reasonable compromise. The one thing that I am not a huge fan of is that I'm going to go back to 9 power, and I'm going to play a little bit with illumination. There I go. One thing I was not a huge fan of, if you look at the reticle carefully, you'll see that there are no numbers until you are 5 milliradian away from center. Once you are 5 mil away from center, you have your first number. The more modern designs usually have numbers every 1 or every 2 milliradian, and from a computational standpoint, or just trying to do something on the clock, I would probably prefer that. My preference is to have a number every 2 milliradian, but once every 1 is probably a little bit better for competition, but with every 2, it's not too bad. I can figure out what the missing numbers are. If you have your first number at 5 and all the milliradian marks look about the same, it's when you're in a rush or excited, nervous, whatever, it's relatively easy to pick the wrong hash mark. Outside of that, I don't have a ton to complain about. I like this design. I like the 0.2 milliradian hash marks. I like that it is visible, and the illumination is generally done rather nicely. As I said, I think it's a perfectly capable scope. Again, we're still on 9 power. I'm gonna look at something else. It focuses down to about 25-30 yards, so I'm gonna see that's roughly where this tree is that I'm pointing at. And when you are on 9 power, I can bring it into reasonable focus, but on lower power, there's a lot of depth of field. So on 4.5, I could kinda do dry practice indoors, but it was not ideal. I found really for indoors, even with a bigger depth of field, I want scope that goes down to about 15, maybe 10, then I can do a lot. On the other hand, the depth of field was pretty good, iBox was very good, and overall I rather enjoyed using the scope. So let's see where we can find the mountain so we can finish this point. I'll shift focus again. When I say focus, I mean side focus parallax. And now you're looking at Sandia. Top of the Sandia mountain range, quite a few miles away, with some shadowing from the branches between us. Capable scope, nice eyepiece, easy to get behind, and the reticle, other than the numbering scheme, really worked rather nicely for me.